Okay, so I think now we've got a little presentation that Danielle helped put together here. So I was going to share my screen. We're just going to go over some of the projects that we're doing in lab and how you can potentially get involved in that. So I've got a little bit of background. It's impossible for me to talk about projects without giving a little bit of background on stuff. So have you guys seen these images before? Not just in Danielle's presentation to your class, but have you seen these images before? Some of you might, especially if you've been involved in speech pathology. Particularly this one on the right, this is what's called the classical model of language in the brain. And it was based on early work by people in the mid 1800s, like Carl Wernicke shown here, or Paul Broca. So what they discovered in the 1800s, is that they didn't have very sophisticated methods, but people with aphasia would, pop up all the time as they do now, because strokes, of course, were prevalent, or other kinds of brain injury. You had a lot more traumatic brain injuries of various kinds back then. You had a lot of soldiers, getting shot in the head, that kind of thing, that we have perhaps less of in the United States now. But there was plenty of brain injury and disorders that would happen, different kinds of disorders. And so what people would notice is that, well, if you had damage to the frontal lobe, you would have speech production problems. We call this area Broca's area. And if you had damage to the temporal lobe, particularly back here, you would have comprehension problems. We call this is called Wernicke's area. And so people actually developed kind of sophisticated models for how these different areas played a role in language production and comprehension. Oops, that's not what I intended to do. So, if the idea was that, well, here's a center in Wernicke's area for what they called like the sound images of language. It's kind of today's term, we might use the term phonology and the lexicon. At the time, they didn't have this kind of terminology, right? So if you have a lesion here, you have a comprehension problem. If you have a lesion in Broca's area, this is like the motor sound images. This is sort of like phonology and morphology for production. So if you damage these areas, you'd have a production problem. And this part here, this is the motor cortex. We know that the motor cortex is involved in like the low-level control of your muscles. So it includes your arms and legs, but also your vocal tract, your mouth, your tongue, the larynx, etc. So the idea was, well, when you're going to try to speak, how do you speak, right? Well, you kind of have an image of the sound that you want to produce, how it sounds like. Then you send it over to Broca's area, which figures out, okay, what are the kind of complex motor programs that I need in order to make that sound. And then that would be shipped off to the primary motor cortex, which would basically execute the program, right? Tell your muscles which ones to contract and which ones not to contract, right? So, and then they were connected via this little, this line here you see, which is called the arcuate fasciculus. It takes a few times to practice to say that correctly, but basically a white matter connection between those areas. And the idea is that if you had this area, this white matter tract, the fasciculus damaged, you would still be able to produce speech pretty well. You'd still be able to understand speech pretty well, but you might have some problems with motor controls, particularly if you make an error. It might be hard to correct that because you have not so good of a connection between the auditory processing stuff and the motor stuff. You wouldn't be able to note the lack of a correspondence, like if you made a mistake. Or if you're trying to repeat something that you don't understand fully, you wouldn't be able to do it so much because these connections are kind of weakened or limited. But now we have much more sophisticated methods, both in terms of neuroscience. So we have, I'll talk about in a second, we've got methods to scan people's brains or to look at their lesions before they've died, right? In the past, you had a subject who had aphasia. You couldn't just crack open their skull and take a look, right? You had to wait till the subject died, which could be a long time, which would be good, right? But it makes it harder to understand the connection between their deficits and where the lesion was in their brain. But now we've got methods we can look at the brain non-invasively. And then we also have much more sophisticated linguistics than we used to. So this is the thing that I'm particularly interested in. This is sort of what the lab's purpose is to do, is to sort of connect these neuroscience methods and the kind of disorders that we see in aphasia with what we know about language that linguistics has taught us over the last like 70, 80 years or so, we've learned a lot about language, like different aspects of that, like phonology, how these different speech sounds work, how they're connected. Morphology and syntax, the idea that words, like the word eats, right? It's decomposed. You've got a verb here and a plural S marker, and how those get arranged both in terms of their order and in terms of their hierarchical structure. If you're taking a linguistics class, I'm sure you've seen plenty of trees, right? And that's something that we particularly love, right? And these, of course, have to connect up to different kinds of semantic processing. So we're basically trying to update this old picture, which is based off of, it actually worked very well, but it just, there's a lot missing, a lot of detail and a lot of sophistication that needs to be added. So the idea is that our goal is to sort of update that with newer methods and the newer linguistics that we've been able to understand. So, some of these methods, one of them is what's called lesion symptom mapping. So it sounds complicated, but lesion means where in the brain is the subject's damage, right? If they have a stroke, what part is damaged, right? People have different kinds of strokes because the vasculature, the blood vessels that feed the brain, there's a complex set of vessels, right? And they damage different kinds of areas differently, right? So one subject, this is a lesion almost entirely in the temporal, parietal, occipital lobes. This subject over here has got primarily a frontal lesion. This is kind of like Broca's area, right? This is kind of like Wernicke's area, but much bigger. And so what we can do is we can have a bunch of subjects, right? So in the aphasia lab, who I work with closely, headed by Dr. Julius Fredrickson, and now Dr. Donauden as well, right? They collect maybe, a couple hundred of these people, right? A couple hundred people with aphasia that come into the lab. We have their brains scanned, we can map out the location of their lesion. And then what we can do is we can do a statistical analysis. We can measure their abilities, right? We can measure their language abilities. We can have them understand words, for example. You give them a word like cat, they have to point to the picture of the cat as opposed to something else, right? Or a sentence, and then we have different kinds of behavioral measures, and then we correlate the location of their damage with the behavior, right? So this is a map of brain areas that are more damaged when people have more difficulty understanding sentences, right? We can see this is in the temporal lobe. This looks a lot like Wernicke's original location, right? But a little bit more detail now, right? And much more sophistication. We also have what's called functional and magnetic resonance imaging. So you guys are probably familiar with MRI. I'm sure have you guys heard of MRI? Magnetic resonance imaging. MRI is used to basically look at any part of your body non-invasively. It's great. So if you have a broken arm, some kind of problem, they put you in the MRI machine to figure out what's the detail of that damage, right? If you have a stroke, we use the MRI machine to figure out where the brain damage is. But what's also nice with these machines is we can do functional imaging, which basically looks in a nutshell at the blood flow in the brain. And the blood flow is basically sending energy to different parts of the brain that are more active. If the brain region is more active, it's doing more stuff, it requires more energy. So there's more blood flow to that area. And we can look at that blood flow, which basically tells us which brain areas are more active at that given time. So if we have them do a task in the scanner, like for example, if they have to produce a phrase or a sentence, we can look at the brain areas that are active while healthy subjects without aphasia, no brain damage, but just while they're sitting in the scanner and they're producing some speech, we can find these areas that are more active while they're doing that task, right? So it's a sort of a nice complement with the lesion symptom mapping and aphasia. We get a picture of what areas are damaged when a subject has difficulty doing something like producing or understanding a sentence. But with fMRI, right, we can look at where are the brain areas that are active when the subject is doing these kinds of tasks, right? And so sort of the lab, we have these two different pictures into the brain. We've got the people with aphasia, we've got a disorder, which we're trying to understand. We're trying to understand the nature of that disorder and what brain areas are damaged associated with that. And then the fMRI, which is a picture into how the healthy brain works, right? And we try to integrate that as much as we can in the lab. Yeah, and so we also like to use sophisticated behavioral methods. So this is a lot of what Danielle is working on. right? But what we can know is that people have difficulties with certain kinds of linguistic structures. A lot of this comes from the linguistic theory that you guys would be learning in a linguistics class, right? Certain kinds of structures are more difficult. And so we like to design more sophisticated tests based on this information and figure out what is that subject, what's a deeper layer into their abilities with language, right? Than just basic stuff like sentence comprehension or production, right? You want to get into the details. Right. So yeah, if you want to join the lab, work on these projects, these are some general things that are really important. So attention to detail, respect for research ethics and the procedures involved. So Danielle probably already contacted you and told you about the city training that basically, when we're dealing with people, we want to make sure that we're behaving in an ethical way, that we obtain their consent, that they're informed about what's happening, that they have the ability to withdraw if they like. If there's protected information, you want to make sure that's kept safe and confidential. Willingness to learn, like the lab, we've got a lot of different things going on, right? So we've got the linguistics, we've got aphasia, we've got fMRI, functional neuroimaging, other kinds of statistical methods. We've got a lot of administrative things. So there's a lot to learn. So the willingness to learn and do all that is great. And also, of course, creativity and enthusiasm. So if you guys are involved in the lab for a while, you might decide that you're interested in a new project or a new idea, and that's potentially something that we can do. And there are, for undergraduates, there are research funds that you can apply for to potentially get, to get some funding to do a project, which we can do. We have done in the past. I've had undergrads do that in the lab. Okay, so in terms of some details, what do you need to learn? Well, one area that's important is called generative grammar. That's a particular linguistic theory, and in particular, the syntax of generative grammar. It's just some of the details for how syntax is sentence structure, right? That's one of the areas where we're particularly interested in the lab. So what is the structure of a sentence? What are possible sentences and sentences that are impossible, right? Like, you can't say something like, who did you see Mary Ann? But you can say, who did you see Mary with? Right? There's a whole theory as to why certain sentences we can produce them and they seem fine. Other ones, they're sort of like don't work. Well, why is that? There's some interesting constraints and theories behind that. You have to learn about aphasia. You have to learn some details about different kinds of aphasia. So we've got fluent aphasia, people that produce speech very readily, but they may have comprehension problems, or non-fluent aphasia, people that understand language very readily, but have difficulty producing speech. And of course, there's some of the details like agrammatism and paragrammatism, which are syndromes that we're particularly interested in. Ethical standards, again, that's very important. And a lot of the work that Danielle is working on involves bilinguals or Spanish-speaking people as well. So that could be something that's relevant if you have knowledge of Spanish, or at least some understanding that could be really helpful, but also just how to deal with research subjects like people with aphasia, how to interact with them. They're typically more older individuals. They've had a stroke, right? They may have communication problems, so you have to be able to communicate and work with them effectively. We also be learning about experimental design. How do you develop a rigorous experiment to test what you're interested in? How to obtain research funding, if that's something you're interested in, we can go through that as well. That can be very helpful for you. You're going to be learning, again, a lot about aphasia in general. So working with the population with a communication disorder, for those of you that might be interested in speech language pathology. Yeah, and here are some things that you'll get from the experience, like knowledge of the scientific process in general, working with the population, like healthy subjects or people with aphasia. So it's probably unlikely that we can get this set up for this semester, but starting next semester, we can create a course. It would basically be a course in public health that you can apply to your degree, and you can get course credit for being in lab, right? So starting next semester, we should be able to enroll you. If you stick around and become interested, we can give you course credit for being part of the lab. And then, of course, if you're able to and interested, if you have the time and the wherewithal, there are opportunities to get grants from the university, small little grants to pay you a little bit of money, maybe a couple $1,000s. and that would fund basically your ability to do research, if that's something that you're interested in. Okay, so we've got a lot of different projects in the lab so far. One is this project that Danielle is working on, basically looking at people with agrammatism and paragrammatism, which are different kinds of grammatical deficits, basically trying to understand the details. Like, well, actually, I've got a good video. Let me show this to you. I'm about to play this. Tell me if it works.
Need to, everybody
okay.
different. Every stroke different.
So just to, again, continue with the background, this is a person who had a stroke, acquired what's called Broca's aphasia, and he looks pretty agrammatic. What I just mentioned, right, we have a couple of these different syndromes. One of them is agrammatism. So just take a look and listen to what he's talking about, how his speech sounds, if you notice some of the problems with the sentence structure of his speech.
But sometimes saying, I need to pictures. I need to pictures because I write or pictures. I love paper and painting. And I think I need to get pictures because now, chair, fine, or table, fine, no problem. But hard, really hard, and why? I don't know. But more small words, no pictures. I don't know. And still, I remember now, but still I can't remember where paper, read better, but still, I don't know. It's really hard to read. Yeah. Meanings is hard because sometimes but cat, okay. Cat, fine. But cat, I don't know, really hard. And I know, but don't know.
Yeah, so that's pretty classic, what we call agrammatic Broca's aphasia. So there are other kinds of grammatical deficits that we see in aphasia too, paragrammatism, where a person is much more fluent than that person, but they also make mistakes, and they're less aware of those mistakes. So we're interested, in the lab, we're interested in what's going on, why? What is the source and the nature of these deficits? There's a lot of discussion of this stuff, but it's fairly unclear. Where in the brain are these different kinds of deficits being caused? Like when you have damage to your brain, where is that produces that kind of a deficit, right? So we have this project, we have an syntactic acceptability judgment task. This is what Danielle is working on. So basically it's comprehension, right? So this is looking at production, what's the nature of the disorder of the sentence structure, while they're producing speech, but also understanding, how do they link different words to make particular structures and understand that? You know, there are deficits of that. So we have a task that's designed to look into that in greater detail. And similarly, we've got fMRI studies that will be getting going, basically looking at the same kinds of things, sentence production and comprehension in healthy subjects. When they're in the scanner, they have to produce a particular kind of sentence structure or comprehend that. And the brain areas are localized for that process in healthy subjects. We work closely with the aphasia lab, and they have a huge database of subjects and tasks that they've already performed. So sometimes we like to go back and look at those pre-existing tasks and analyze those data. Oops, that's kind of crazy. There's also these projects here. Danielle, maybe you can describe these 3 other projects.
Yeah, so the 3 other ones are, really focused on bilingualism. There's the Bilingual Insights project. This project, we're currently norming the words, which means we're testing them to make sure that they're appropriate for the study in basically a smaller behavioral experiment. And then we're going to do an fMRI study looking at words that overlap partially between languages, either in terms of grammar or partially in terms of meaning. So if you speak another language, you probably know words like that are cognates, words that are really similar both in terms of meaning and pronunciation between the languages. But what we know about words is all words have some grammatical information. So the grammar could be the same cross-linguistically or could overlap only partially. And some words, they have a kind of a similar meaning in another language and they sound similar, but they don't mean quite exactly the same thing. So we're interested in looking at in the word level, differentiating the processing of meaning from the processing of that grammatical information using words that relate across languages. And how we can do this is all of your languages go in the same parts of your brain, and all of your words are stored in one store of words. So that's that project. The third language acquisition project is also looking at grammar processing. Sort of at the word level with morphosyntax. So it's looking at people who are learning Portuguese as a 3rd language, and they speak English and Spanish already. And we know in English, we have that plural S marker. In Spanish, you've got that plural S marker also, and it's across the noun phrase. So you put it on your article, like a or the, and you also put it on your adjective. And as well, in Spanish and Portuguese, you have grammatical gender. So you mark casa, which ends with an A, it's feminine, and that gets spread across as well. Or you have perro, I'm looking at my dog outside, and that's masculine. It's got the O, and that again spreads across the noun phrase. So we're looking at whether people are accurate and quick in both Spanish and Portuguese. And then finally, the Spanish English listening study is kind of related to both of those things in terms of what it's looking at. It's got cognates that overlap at differing levels of pronunciation and grammar between Spanish and English. So people listen to those in the tasks. And those last 2 that I was just mentioning, those projects are already set up. There is some data already, but we're continuing to recruit people and run subjects in that.
Right. Yeah. So we've got a lot of things going on, many projects, and they require different levels of knowledge and expertise and abilities, and they have different, potential interests to you. So, for example, this analysis of the agrammatic and paragrammatic discourses, basically what we have is the subject is telling the story of Cinderella in their own words. We've got a few minutes of recordings, basically, the transcripts of the recording of them telling the story, right? So basically what we're doing is going through each line of that transcript and analyzing the grammar of the sentence, right? Is there a problem with the grammar? What's the nature of that problem? What kind of problem is it? So to work on this project, you'd be working closely with Dr. Fahey. But it'd be useful for that project to have a background a little bit in syntax, to know about those structures, right? And then to learn in the lab about agrammatism and paragrammatism in particular, right? So this project requires a little bit more experience. So if you've taken linguistics already and you have a decent background in syntax, this could be a good fit for you if you're interested in trying to apply some of what you learned in syntax and morphology and other aspects of language too, really, to the analysis. So this would be for a little bit more experience, which you may gain, of course, if you don't have that already over time, right? Over your year of classes. Then the SAS task, this is, again, Dr. Fahey is doing this task. It's already created, and we're basically now trying to collect data on people with aphasia. So this really involves working with the group of people with aphasia, right? So we need to recruit them, we have to contact them, and maybe through their caretaker or family, have them either come to the lab or do this online. And so you have to work with that population. So it's a really good experience for working with them and being able to run the task. So of course, being diligent and responsible with that is very important. So we're looking for people to help with that. So if you want some hands-on experience with people with aphasia, this would be a great one. With the fMRI studies, we're still developing these, but these would basically involve, if you were involved with that, you could help us run the task at the scanner, right? So we have to install them into the scanner, prepare them, have them fill out some forms. We have to prepare the scanner, to make sure it's ready for a person to go in. So, that would be very helpful work. And also contacting and scheduling people, recruiting, maybe putting up flyers around campus, and training the subjects before they get in the scanner. Like we'll have them probably practice the experiment and do some training. So that's really helpful. So, this doesn't require as much of the linguistics, but it's still interesting in terms of learning about fMRI, learning about the scanner, how it works, how you collect data. And that's something that we could use a lot of help with as well. And then of course, like I mentioned, we're reanalyzing some data that's already been collected. So what's important for this is that sometimes we have to go back to the records. We have records of the score sheets that people with aphasia have done, and we're interested in looking at subparts of that we haven't yet gone into that level of detail, right? So this might involve going into the database, right, and looking through the original score sheets and collecting, looking at their performance on some more subparts of the task and recording that. And so that would also involve, learning a lot about those batteries, right? So with aphasia, there's some standardized batteries. One of them is called the Western aphasia battery, right? Almost everyone in the United States who has a stroke and is, thought to maybe be at risk for aphasia will have this battery of tests. Comprehension and production of different kinds of things, different kinds of tasks. So you learn a lot about that, the details of those tasks, and then of course, the details of the particular items that we're interested in. So there's that. Maybe Danielle, you could cover these.
Yeah, so the bilingual insights project, as I said, we're in the norming stages of it. So the norming study is already going on. If you would be interested in, helping us put together the next step in this project, it hasn't been set up yet. You could learn about experimental design and be involved in that part, but you would need to know Spanish because this is Spanish English stimuli, the language in the experiment. So if you didn't have familiarity with Spanish, this would kind of be out of your abilities probably.
Right, but this will be running the fMRI as well. So this would be one of the studies that you could help out with in that respect, in running the study at the scanner. Right.
That part wouldn't require the Spanish, but if you wanted to help put together the experimental part, there's the Spanish needed.
Right. you want to do this one, Danielle?
So as I said, this one is, already put together. Folks who do this experiment are recruited out of the Portuguese classes at UofSC. You don't need to know Spanish or Portuguese. You would just have to learn how to proctor the experiment. If you knew Spanish or Portuguese, it could be helpful, but you're not allowed to help them if they're like, I don't know the answer, tell me the answer. Well, you can't. So
Yeah.
you don't actually need to know these languages. It just could be helpful potentially later.
And you may learn a little bit about these languages by working on it as well,
Yeah.
Right. Do you want to do this one?
Yeah. So again, speaking Spanish is very helpful for this one, but again, not necessary because everyone who participates in this study takes a pretest in both Spanish and English. So they have to score intermediate level. So this is there's an international scoring system. So they have to get a B1 in both in the CFR scoring system in both Spanish and English. So it can be proctored in English because everyone is fluent in English. And so in both this experiment and the prior one that I was just describing, participants are doing tasks in both languages. So in the third language one, they're seeing stuff in a block in Portuguese, and then they're seeing stuff in a block of Spanish. This one, they have different blocks. In some blocks are English and some blocks are Spanish. But yeah, it's already set up, so you would just learn how to run it, and then you could run it with a participant and help collect the data, and maybe even learn how to analyze the data.
Cool. So that's pretty much all we've got for a little presentation. But I think now is a good time if you guys have any questions. So, any questions about the lab, about the projects, about, course credit or funding, feel free to jump in.
Or different projects you want to be involved in. And I apologize to Marcella because I didn't mention the project that you're working on.
Yes, Marcella just started a couple of weeks ago and has already got her hands deep into a lot of data, so we're very appreciative of that. Yeah, so I mean, other questions you guys might have, again, are careers and things like that. So our group is pretty diverse. My background is in linguistics and psychology and neuroscience. But Danielle has a background in linguistics and TESOL. Marcella is a training speech pathologist. So we all come from different backgrounds. So if you've got questions, I mean, what you'll be learning in this research could be useful for a variety of different things. Like like I said, if you want to become a speech pathologist, you'll definitely be gaining a lot of knowledge and experience. You'll be having if you enroll in that course next semester, you'd have a ComD course that's in this area, which will look good for grad applications. If you're interested in doing research or eventually maybe doing a PhD or just going down that track, then this is be right up your alley. It would be very helpful. Yeah, I don't know. Any questions or thoughts?
Or any
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So if we do want to get involved, is there like an application process or do we just sign up? What does that look like?
You basically just go ahead and email. You can email Dr. Fahey and myself and just basically say, we'll be having regular lab meetings, but what we want to do is probably just set up a meeting with you so that we can talk about, we can just go over your background, figure out what kinds of projects are relevant and try to get you started. Like I said, I think it's too late to do the course for this semester, I believe. I'm not 100% sure on that, I will check, but definitely we can do that for next semester. So it probably would be good to get involved a bit this semester, learn the ropes, and then we can do the official class next semester. Although I'll look into the possibility of doing it for this semester.
Yeah.
But then we have, so basically just email Dr. Fahey and myself if you're interested in getting involved in a project. And then we have lab meetings every couple of weeks. We have a lab meeting, and it'll be similar to this, but usually what we do is we kind of catch up on what we've been working on, and we either discuss a paper or an ongoing project, so different people may jump in and present a little bit on what they're working on, or if there's a paper that's interesting to them. So in these lab meetings, that's sort of the class-like component of that. You'd be learning about the field and the research that's ongoing in those lab meetings, and of course in your informal or separate meetings you'd be having with me or Dr. Fahey.
Yeah. So, related to what Dr. Machen is saying, like some of the projects, as we mentioned, you do need to know something already to start working on them, but a lot of them don't require much background at all, and we could train you as you go. But the lab meetings, they're low key, they're informal, and we learn from each other. So, if I'm working on a project and I tell people how I've been working on it, but I'm kind of stuck on something, I tell people, and you guys could have creative ideas that are helpful as well. So that's part of why labs or groups like this that have all these projects going on, because even if you're not working on the project, you can help with the ideas and kind of the supportive atmosphere of it.
Right. Yeah, so the kind of the philosophy with the lab with our undergraduates, right? Like if you take the course, you get course credit. This semester, I don't think it's possible to get the course credit, but regardless, we try to have a balance between work that's helpful for you to do for us, something like going to the database and looking at some tasks. You'll get something out of that, but it becomes a lot of work that is just very helpful for you to do for us. But we try to balance that also out with these discussions. We'll have private meetings. We'll be figuring out your interests and your knowledge and trying to provide that background and training to you. And then of course, if you go on to do other things, you can ask us potentially for references and that kind of thing. So it's part of what you'll be getting out of that. Zakila, I think you have a question. Go ahead.
Is there like a minimum of hours we should be able to work per week?
That's a great question. So for the course, I believe it's 10, I think it's 10 hours, maybe. I have to look into that. The course may be less, but I think we're looking for around 10 hours a week. Yeah.
And
and that includes lab meetings and discussions and things like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's flexible too. So like, if it gets to be finals week, we're not going to be like, oh, you didn't get those 10 hours in.
Right.
That's,
Yeah.
you get into it and you might have more time one week and you might have less time another week. And especially if you're not taking it for a course, we're not going to be breathing down your neck.
Could we also apply it to like work study? Would this be considered work study?
I don't think this is a normal work study. It depends on funding. So we have funding right now that's limited, but we like paying Dr. Fahey's salary, and we're paying Marcella for her work as well. She's a master's student. But so we don't have funding from the lab to pay undergraduates, but you can potentially apply for internal grant funding from the university. So if you've been working with me for a while, you could apply to get some funding from the university, which would basically pay for your salary, basically a couple $1,000s over a year or so. So that's something that's possible, but not in the immediate short term.
Okay.
Yeah.
I had a question. If we already have like the CITI certification, do we just like send that to one of you?
Yes, I think you send that to Dr. Fahey, we can upload that pretty easily and get that going. So that's great. Yeah. The city training is,
or Dr. Machen, because I don't know where that goes.
you know where that goes. Okay, yeah, send it to me. I'll figure it out. Yeah, I think I can just upload it. Yeah.
Okay.
I have to
Also,
renew mine. I know it's kind of a long, annoying process. It takes a couple hours. So
yeah,
you
I
won't have to
think
redo it if you've already done it.
I did it for a class for an assignment. So I was like, oh, this is convenient. I already have it done.
That's great. No, it's not something you want to keep doing over and over again.
Yeah. Also, I'm also in like the honors college and I'm starting to like work on like my thesis. Like I'm working on the thesis prep right now. Will we be able to like kind of use whatever we do in the lab for?
Absolutely, absolutely. So I had an honor student a couple of years ago who did that. She worked with me. She was actually, because I know the honors college has some kind of separate grants as well through the Magellan program. So she was able to get Magellan funding to work on her thesis. So that would be wonderful, and we would love to have that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so I think Ashley had asked, I don't know if she's gone already. I think Ashley, maybe you're still there, but yeah, we will keep you in the loop about that. We'll probably send this via like a link via email to everyone who is interested in, so that they can go take a look at that. Would you guys be okay if I put this online on like the lab website? Is that okay with everyone here? Or to post that? Yeah, I think it might be useful for potential future prospective students as well. So that would be great to have. So if you put it on the lab website, we'll send it out as well to everyone that was interested. Yeah, well, I think we're kind of wrapping up here. I mean, always feel free to email us with questions, and really we can set up a meeting. So if you're interested in doing work, just email us, we'll set up a meeting, we'll chat, we'll learn more about your background and your time availability and interests, and then we'll figure out basically a project for you to get started with. I really appreciate you coming and your interest, and we hope to see some of you in the future. We'll keep you posted about the next lab meeting as well. So we'll try to invite everyone back to come to that. Okay. Well, I think that's it. Unless there's any last minute questions, speak now or forever hold your peace. So your last opportunity. Okay. Well, it's good seeing everyone, and I'll see you next time.
Bye. Nice to meet
Thank
all of
you.
you guys.
All right, thank you.
Have a good one.
See ya.